Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Explore Everything. Today we're diving deep into the blazing trails of the Old West, uncovering how cowboys survived deadly heat on the cattle drives. Imagine endless miles of dry desert, the sun like fire overhead, and herds of restless cattle pushing forward through dust and danger. This isn't just history, it's a story of grit, sweat, and survival beneath a merciless sky. So saddle up, because the journey's about to begin. When we talk about the legendary cattle drives of the 1800s, we often picture open prairies, endless herds, and the fearless cowboys riding into the sunset. But what's rarely told is the sheer brutality of the heat they faced day after day. The reality wasn't a romantic Western postcard, it was a test of human endurance against nature's most unforgiving element, the sun. During the great cattle drives that stretched from Texas up to Kansas or even farther north, cowboys rode for months across treeless plains, deserts, and river valleys where temperatures could soar well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, about 38 to 40 degrees Celsius. The blazing sun beat down mercilessly on man and beast alike, turning every metal buckle, stirrup, or gun barrel into a branding iron. Dust clung to every pore and sweat offered no relief. It evaporated as quickly as it formed. The air shimmered with heat waves and the earth itself seemed to burn. Cowboys could feel it radiating through the soles of their boots, through the dry leather saddles, and through their bodies as if they were riding through a furnace. Some described it as riding through hell with the gates wide open. The cattle, restless and thirsty, bellowed constantly, their hides baking under the same sun. There were no cool breezes, no clouds for shade, and certainly no air-conditioned trucks or water bottles. Every drop of water was precious, and even when they found a stream or river, it was often muddy, warm, or shared with thousands of cattle. Cowboys learned to ration their sips carefully, knowing that dehydration could strike fast. The human body can only take so much, and in that heat even the toughest man could collapse without warning. The days were long, sometimes stretching to 14 or 16 hours in the saddle. From dawn till dusk, cowboys pushed herds across parched landscapes where shade was a luxury. Their skin darkened and cracked, lips split from dryness, and eyes burned from the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off dust and sand. Sunscreen didn't exist, so the only protection came from wide-brimmed hats and bandanas pulled high over their faces. But it wasn't just the direct heat that tested them, it was the combination of heat, fatigue, and constant movement. Horses struggled under the same conditions, sometimes stumbling from exhaustion. When a horse went down, it wasn't just a setback. It could mean a cowboy was stranded, miles from camp, with no shelter from the burning sky. Dust storms made everything worse. As cattle moved in great numbers, their hooves kicked up thick clouds that hung in the air, trapping heat like a suffocating blanket. The air became so heavy and hot that breathing felt like inhaling fire. Cowboys would tie damp bandanas over their mouths and noses, but after a few minutes, those too would dry out and turn to crusted cloth. The heat mixed with dust made every breath painful. Then came the mirages, illusions born from the shimmering heat. Cowboys often thought they saw distant rivers or lakes on the horizon, only to ride closer and find nothing but more scorched land. That mental trickery added frustration to exhaustion. It wasn't uncommon for cowboys to start hallucinating after days of relentless exposure. Some claimed to see ghost rivers, or phantom clouds promising rain that never came. Even the nights offered little comfort. The heat radiated back from the ground, keeping the air warm long after sunset. Cowboys tried to sleep on the hard earth, but it was often still hot to the touch. Campfires weren't needed, the heat itself was enough. And if a breeze did come, it was usually dry and dusty, carrying the smell of sweat, cattle, and scorched grass. To make matters worse, the cattle themselves reacted poorly to the extreme heat. They grew restless, unpredictable, and prone to stampeding. A single loud noise or flash of lightning could set off thousands of frightened animals running blindly across the plains. Cowboys would have to leap from their bedrolls in the middle of the night, mount up, and chase after the herd, even if the temperature was still sweltering. There was no rest, no true relief from the sun's power. Many cowboys carried the scars of that life: sunburned skin that never fully healed, vision problems from the glare, and dehydration that left their bodies permanently weakened. Some didn't survive at all. They collapsed from heatstroke miles from camp, sometimes never found again. But for those who endured, the heat became a symbol of pride. They learned to respect it, not fight it. They adapted their pace, their routines, and their very mindset around the rhythm of the sun. In that vast, unforgiving wilderness, survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about endurance, discipline, and knowing when to push forward and when to pause. The blazing heat shaped the cowboy's character as much as any trail or cattle herd. It burned away weakness, leaving behind men of steel and spirit. Men who knew what it meant to fight the elements and keep going when everything around them screamed to stop. The scorching reality of the cattle trail was the great equalizer. It didn't matter if a man was young or old, experienced or new. Under that sun everyone was humbled. It tested their willpower every single day, and those who made it through didn't just earn a paycheck, they earned a legend. On the cattle drives of the Old West, water was more than a necessity, it was life itself. For the cowboys, their horses, and the thousands of cattle they guided across the sun-baked plains, every drop mattered. The unforgiving landscapes of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas were vast and dry, and rivers could vanish into dust during the brutal summer months. Finding water became a daily mission, one that determined whether a drive succeeded or ended in disaster. Imagine riding beneath a blazing sky for hours with your tongue sticking to the roof of your mouth, lips cracked, and sweat turning to salt on your skin. The canteens tied to your saddle were your lifeline. But even those small metal containers grew hot, the water inside tasting like warm iron. There was no such thing as cool drinking water, just enough to keep a man from collapsing. Cowboys learned early that thirst wasn't something you could ignore. It was a slow, creeping danger that could take your strength long before it took your life. A typical cattle drive might cover 10 to 15 miles a day, sometimes more depending on the terrain and the weather. The herds moved slowly, kicking up dust that made the air almost unbreathable. The men had to watch not only the cattle but also the trail ahead, constantly scanning for signs of water, the glint of light on the horizon, a patch of green grass, or a line of trees that might mark a stream. The trail boss often rode ahead, following old maps, Indian paths, and word-of-mouth directions from settlers or scouts who knew where watering holes might still exist. But the land was unpredictable. What had been a river one season could be nothing more than a cracked bed of clay the next. When they finally did find water, it wasn't always what they hoped for. Many times, it was a muddy puddle shared by dozens of animals before them. Cowboys had to skim away the surface muck and strain out insects with their bandanas before drinking. Some carried tin cups, others used their hats as makeshift scoops. They learned to sip, not gulp, knowing that overdrinking too quickly after dehydration could make them sick. Water discipline wasn't just a rule, it was survival wisdom passed from one trail hand to another. For the cattle, the struggle was even more desperate. A thirsty herd could grow restless and dangerous. The lowing of thousands of animals in search of water was an eerie sound that carried across the plains. If a cowboy let them smell water before reaching it, they might stampede toward it uncontrollably, trampling one another in panic. So the men had to approach every water stop with strategy, moving the herd slowly, guiding them to drink in smaller groups, and ensuring that the weaker animals got their share. It was a delicate balance between control and chaos, especially when exhaustion clouded everyone's judgment. The chuck wagon carried a limited supply of water for cooking and coffee, carefully rationed by the cook, often the most feared man in camp when supplies ran low. Cowboys might be allowed only a small dipper of water for washing at the end of the day, if that. Most simply wiped the dust from their faces and went to sleep dirty, saving what little they had for drinking. Soap and bathing were luxuries few could afford in the middle of a 1,000-mile journey through heat and dust. Sometimes, desperation forced the cowboys to take risks. They dug into dry riverbeds, hoping to find damp sand that could yield a few precious drops. They followed animal tracks, knowing that deer or wild mustangs often led to hidden springs. They even watched the flight patterns of birds, because flocks tended to circle above water sources. Every sense became attuned to the land's subtle signs. A shift in vegetation, a change in smell, even the faint sound of insects buzzing near stagnant pools. But water on the trail wasn't always safe. In stagnant pools, bacteria and parasites thrived. Cowboys who drank from contaminated sources risked dysentery or cholera, illnesses that spread fast in the heat and could kill within days. There was no doctor on the trail, no medicine to fall back on. A man could go from strong to feverish and weak in a single afternoon. Still, they drank because the choice was simple: sickness or certain death from thirst. The horses were treated with as much care as the men, sometimes more. Without healthy mounts, cowboys couldn't ride, rope, or control the herd. A horse weakened by dehydration could stumble or collapse, leaving its rider stranded miles from camp. So cowboys often gave part of their own water to their animals, even if it meant going thirsty themselves. That bond between rider and horse ran deep, forged in the heat and the struggle for every precious sip. When thunderstorms did come, sudden and violent on the open plains, they were both a blessing and a curse. Cowboys would stretch out tarps, hats, and bandanas to collect the rainwater, laughing as they filled canteens and soaked their faces. But the joy was short-lived. The same storms could flood low-lying trails and create dangerous mud that slowed the drive to a crawl. Water in every form had to be respected. Too little brought death, too much brought chaos. Even the cattle seemed to sense the value of water. After long dry stretches, they'd crowd together at the edge of a stream, pushing and shoving for space, their bodies steaming as they cooled down. The smell of wet hide, dust, and mud filled the air. Cowboys stood watch to prevent fights or drownings, using their ropes and whips to keep order. When the last animal had drunk its fill, the men finally took their turn, kneeling beside the same murky pool, scooping handfuls into their mouths, grateful for every gritty drop. In the harsh world of the cattle drives, hydration wasn't just about drinking water, it was about reading the land, respecting its power, and understanding that nature held all the control. Every mile without water tested not only the strength of the cowboy's body but also the resilience of his mind. It reminded them that in the blazing wilderness of the West, survival depended not on wealth or weapons, but on the simple, fragile gift of water itself. When people picture a cowboy, they often imagine a rugged figure in a wide-brimmed hat, dusty boots, and a faded shirt, a timeless symbol of the American frontier. But what most don't realize is that every piece of that outfit wasn't just for style or tradition. It was born from necessity, forged through the unforgiving conditions of the trail. Under the scorching sun and endless dust of the cattle drives, a cowboy's clothing was his armor, his first and often only line of defense against a world that offered no mercy. Out on the open plains, there was no shelter, no shade, and no relief from the elements. The sun could roast the earth by midday, and the hot winds carried sharp dust that cut like sandpaper. To survive, cowboys had to think smart, to cover up, protect their skin, and use every piece of clothing as a tool for endurance. Their attire was designed not for fashion but for survival. Every stitch had a purpose, every layer told a story. The most iconic piece, the wide-brimmed hat, often a Stetson, was much more than a cowboy's trademark. It was a shield against the blazing sun. With brims wide enough to cast shade over the face, neck, and shoulders, it kept men from burning and their vision clear in the harsh glare. A good hat could mean the difference between heatstroke and endurance. Cowboys treated their hats with care, shaping them to suit their needs. The crease at the top wasn't just style, it allowed heat to escape. Many also used their hats as scoops for water or fans for starting campfires. When the rain came, the same hat helped channel water away from their faces. It was in every sense the cowboy's most valuable possession, a practical crown of survival. Then came the bandana, a simple square of cloth that became a multi-purpose tool on the trail. In the heat and dust of the cattle drive, it served as a lifeline. Cowboys tied it around their necks to protect from sunburn, pulled it over their noses and mouths to filter out dust during drives, or soaked it in water to cool themselves in moments of unbearable heat. When the wind whipped up sandstorms, a wet bandana over the face could make breathing possible. Some even used it as a rag, a sling, or a washcloth when water was scarce. That piece of cloth, often brightly colored, symbolized the blend of practicality and grit that defined the cowboy way of life. Long-sleeved cotton shirts might seem counterintuitive in deadly heat, but they were essential. Thin enough to breathe yet strong enough to shield the skin, they protected against sunburn and dehydration. The sleeves kept the arms from cracking and blistering under the relentless sun. Sweat soaked into the fabric, cooling the skin as it evaporated, nature's own air conditioning. Most shirts were made of lightweight cotton or linen, allowing airflow while providing coverage. Cowboys didn't wear short sleeves. They knew bare skin under the sun meant pain, not comfort. These shirts also acted as a barrier against insects, thorns, and the rough hide of cattle brushing past during the drive. Over their legs, cowboys wore durable denim trousers, the forerunner of today's jeans. The thick fabric could withstand heat, sweat, and abrasion from saddles or brush. Riding for 10 to 15 hours a day meant constant friction, and only the strongest materials could endure that punishment. The trousers often darkened with dust and sweat, becoming stiff and crusted by the end of the day. Yet they lasted, offering both comfort and protection. Denim, paired with leather chaps, became the perfect defense against thorns, snake bites, and the searing contact of sun-baked saddles. The leather chaps, short for chaparreras, were perhaps the most iconic part of a cowboy's lower wear. Made from thick hide, they protected the rider's legs from brush, barbed wire, and the occasional kick from an irritated steer. But in the heat, they also offered an unexpected advantage. They blocked hot winds and reflected some of the sun's intensity, keeping the inner layer of clothing slightly cooler. When a cowboy dismounted to walk or rest, he often draped his chaps across the saddle, letting the air hit his sweat-soaked jeans beneath. Leather was heavy, yes, but it was dependable, the one material that could take abuse day after day and still hold strong. Then there were the boots, high-heeled, pointed, and crafted for endurance. The design wasn't about style, it was functional genius. The pointed toes slid easily into stirrups, while the raised heels kept the feet from slipping through. The tall shafts protected from heat, snake bites, and thorns. But what's often overlooked is how boots helped regulate temperature. In scorching heat, the leather acted like insulation, trapping some of the body's moisture, preventing rapid dehydration through the feet. Cowboys stuffed their boots with wool socks or even cloth scraps to prevent blisters. After hours of riding, their feet would ache, but without those boots they wouldn't last a single day on the trail. To complete the ensemble, cowboys carried gloves, usually made of deer or cowhide. Handling ropes, reins, and rough cattle hide under the blazing sun took a toll on bare hands. The gloves shielded against friction burns and blisters, while also keeping the sun from cracking the skin. Rope burns were not just painful, they could become infected, a serious danger in the dusty plains. So gloves weren't optional, they were essential gear. Even their vests and coats, though heavy, played a role in surviving the heat. Worn during early mornings or evenings when temperatures dropped suddenly, they helped maintain body balance. A cowboy's body had to adjust constantly, from freezing dawns to scorching noons. Layering wasn't about fashion, it was strategy. The vest's pockets held matches, tobacco, and personal items, but its snug fit also allowed air to circulate while protecting vital organs from direct sun exposure. Every cowboy understood that in the wild, your clothing wasn't just what you wore, it was part of your survival instinct. There was no shade to hide under, no shelter to retreat to, no convenience of spare outfits. You wore what worked, and if it failed, the land would teach you a harsh lesson. Each piece, from hat to boot, was tested by miles of sunburnt trail and nights of hard riding. Together, they formed not just a uniform of the West, but a shield against its fury, silent, practical, and life-saving. In the relentless world of the cattle drives, time wasn't measured by clocks or calendars, it was measured by the sun. Every move the cowboys made, every decision on when to ride, rest, or water the herd, depended on the rhythm of the daylight and the temperature it brought. In an environment where the heat could turn deadly by midday, survival hinged on timing, the fine art of knowing when to move and when to wait. The cowboys understood early on that to outsmart the sun, they had to live by its patterns. They didn't fight the heat, they worked around it. Days began before the horizon even began to glow, often as early as 3 or 4 in the morning. While most of the world still slept, the trail came alive with the low murmur of men preparing for another long stretch of the drive. The cook would be the first to stir, clanging pots and firing up the camp stove, boiling coffee that was as thick as mud but strong enough to keep a man awake. The smell of biscuits, beans, and smoke drifted through the camp while the cowboys tightened saddle cinches and checked gear under starlight. The goal was simple, to get as many miles behind them as possible before the sun rose to full strength. At dawn, the herd would already be moving, the air still cool, the light soft and forgiving. The first few hours of morning were precious. Horses trotted easily, the cattle were calm, and men could breathe without feeling the sting of the sun. It was the only time of day when the world felt somewhat merciful. As the morning wore on and the heat began to rise, the cowboys' pace slowed. Around late morning, somewhere between 10 and noon, the trail boss would start looking for a good spot to stop. The ground needed to be open enough for the herd to graze and rest but close enough to water if possible. Shade was rare, but even a cluster of trees or a shallow ridge could offer some relief. By midday, when the sun blazed directly overhead, everything came to a halt. The cattle were too hot to move, the horses too exhausted, and the men too weary to continue. This midday pause wasn't just a luxury, it was vital. Moving cattle in the peak of heat could be deadly, they could collapse or stampede in panic. So the herd would spread out, finding whatever bits of grass they could. The men would take to the ground, hats pulled low over their faces, resting under wagons or using saddles as pillows. Some used wet bandanas to cool their necks, others simply closed their eyes and tried to ignore the burning air. The world would fall eerily silent except for the buzzing of insects and the occasional grunt of cattle. Even the wind seemed to stop, as if the land itself was holding its breath until the heat broke. During these hours, the chuck wagon became the center of life. The cook, known as the belly cheater or koozie, worked tirelessly under the blazing sky, preparing what passed for lunch, often beans, salt pork, or leftover biscuits from breakfast. Coffee was always on the fire, its bitter taste familiar and comforting. Cowboys ate quickly, conserving energy. Conversation was minimal, the heat made everyone quiet. Some took the time to mend tack, clean weapons, or check hooves, but most simply rested, knowing another long stretch awaited when the sun began to fall. By late afternoon, when the shadows started to lengthen and the worst of the heat began to fade, the men saddled up again. The herd would be coaxed back into motion, slow and steady. The cooler air revived both man and beast, though exhaustion never fully left their bones. The pace picked up slightly as they took advantage of the remaining light. The setting sun painted the plains in orange and gold, and though beautiful, it also signaled the start of another crucial transition, from day to night. Evening drives were often the most peaceful. The cattle, tired from the day's journey, tended to move quietly. The cowboys rode with calm determination, the rhythm of hooves blending with the soft lowing of the herd. It was a time for reflection, when the struggles of the day melted into the cool breeze of twilight. The heat finally loosened its grip, and the plains became alive again with distant sounds, coyotes calling, wind rustling through dry grass, the soft clink of metal on saddle leather. By nightfall, around 8 or 9, the trail boss called a halt. The herd was bedded down in a circular formation, watched over by night riders who took turns keeping guard. The danger wasn't over. A sudden noise, a flash of lightning, or a drifting shadow could set off a stampede. But at least the air was cooler and the men could breathe again. The rest of the crew gathered near the chuck wagon, sharing stories or quiet moments under the stars. Some wrote in small journals, others simply listened to the creak of the wagons and the occasional snort of horses. Cowboys didn't sleep through the night. They worked in shifts. 2 to 4 men at a time would circle the herd, singing low songs to keep the cattle calm. These night songs were a mix of lullabies, old folk tunes, and improvised verses. The music wasn't for entertainment, it was a tool to soothe the animals. The slow, steady rhythm reassured the herd that all was safe. It was another example of how time ruled everything. Every hour of the day and night had its own rhythm, its own ritual. The next morning, before the first hint of dawn, it all began again. Cowboys rose sore and dusty, boots stiff from the day before, bodies aching from the saddle. But they didn't complain. They knew that the only way to survive the sun's wrath was to work with it, not against it. The pattern repeated day after day, early rides, midday halts, twilight drives. The routine became second nature, an instinct born from hard experience and necessity. Timing wasn't just about comfort, it was about control. By moving early and late, the cowboys kept both themselves and the herd alive. The sun might have ruled the sky, but the cowboys learned to read its moods, to sense its danger before it struck, and to adapt their lives around its fiery path. In a land where the heat could kill and the earth could crack open beneath your horse's hooves, time wasn't something to be managed, it was something to be respected. On the cattle drives of the Old West, food wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. Every meal was hard-earned, every bite a product of sweat, planning, and endurance. The men who rode the trails for weeks or even months at a time depended on one vital part of their world, the chuck wagon. More than just a mobile kitchen, it was the heart of the trail, the one place that brought the cowboys together, fed their strength, and lifted their spirits under the punishing sun. The chuck wagon, invented by Charles Goodnight in the late 1860s, was a masterstroke of practicality. Built from a sturdy wagon, often a modified army surplus or freight wagon, it carried everything the crew needed to eat, cook, and sometimes even patch up wounds. Its rear section folded down into a cooking station, complete with drawers, shelves, and compartments that held everything from flour and beans to coffee and bacon. The rest of the wagon carried heavy iron pots, pans, tools, and barrels of water or lard. A cowboy's entire diet and morale rolled on those wooden wheels. At the center of it all was the cook, often called the cookie, or koozie. He wasn't just a chef, he was the most respected and feared man on the drive, second only to the trail boss. His job was grueling, rising hours before dawn to prepare breakfast, cooking through midday heat, and serving dinner long after others had finished their work. He managed supplies, rationed portions, and made sure nothing went to waste. The cowboys might grumble about his strictness or his temper, but they knew one thing for sure: angering the cook could make your life miserable. Out on the trail, a man could survive a bad saddle or a dust storm, but a cook's bad mood could mean going hungry. The food itself was simple, heavy, and designed to endure the harsh environment. There were no fresh vegetables, no luxury ingredients, and certainly no variety. Instead, the staples of trail life were foods that lasted: beans, biscuits, bacon, coffee, and beef. These formed the backbone of cowboy nutrition. It It wasn't gourmet, but it kept them alive. Beans were the foundation. Packed with protein, they were filling, cheap, and easy to store. Cooked over an open fire in cast iron pots, beans simmered for hours, flavored with bits of salt pork, onions, or even chili peppers when available. The smell became a trail signature, smoky, earthy, comforting in its own way. Some men joked they'd eaten so many beans that they'd never be free of them again. Bacon or salt pork was another essential. It provided fat, flavor, and energy for long days in the saddle. Because it was salted and cured, it could survive for months without spoiling. Cowboys often fried it up in the morning alongside beans or crumbled it into biscuits at night. The sizzling of bacon grease in a pan was a sound that promised a rare comfort, a reminder of civilization in a wild land. Then there were the biscuits, or sourdoughs as they were sometimes called. The cook made them daily using flour, baking powder, and lard, a simple recipe that produced dense, hearty bread perfect for soaking up gravy or stew. Without ovens, everything was baked in Dutch ovens, heavy cast iron pots buried in coals. The result was crisp on the outside, soft inside, and often the best part of the meal. Some cooks became legends for their biscuits alone, their skill determining how well fed and satisfied the men felt at the end of a long, brutal day. And, of course, there was coffee, the lifeblood of the trail. Cowboys drank it morning, noon, and night, thick and black as tar. It was boiled in giant pots until the ground sank to the bottom, often strong enough to jolt even the most exhausted rider back to life. Coffee was more than a drink, it was ritual. It started the day, ended the day, and filled the quiet spaces in between. Around the campfire, coffee mugs clinked as men swapped stories, planned the next leg of the journey, or simply sat in silence, staring into the flames. It was bitter, sometimes burnt, but always welcome. When supplies allowed, the cook might add variety: dried fruit, jerky, molasses, or hardtack, a rock-hard bread that could last indefinitely but required soaking before it could be chewed. Occasionally they slaughtered a weak or injured cow for fresh beef, roasting it over open flames or boiling it into stew. For special occasions or when passing through settlements, there might even be pies or cobblers made from canned fruit. Those moments felt like feasts in a world otherwise ruled by monotony. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. After days of dust, thirst, and sunburn, the smell of hot coffee or frying bacon lifted spirits in ways words couldn't. Around the chuck wagon, the Cowboys became a family of sorts. They shared jokes, teased the cook, and forgot, if only briefly, the endless miles ahead. The wagon was where laughter returned, where quarrels were mended, and where silence could feel comforting instead of lonely. But the cook's job wasn't easy. He faced the same blistering heat as everyone else, yet his fire burned hotter. Cooking over open flames under a 100-degree sun meant enduring waves of heat from both sky and ground. His hands were burned, his clothes always stained, and his temper sometimes short. He worked in constant motion, chopping, stirring, rolling dough, and serving up to 15 hungry men 3 times a day. When the drive moved, he packed everything quickly, tying pots and pans to the wagon so they clanged and rattled like a moving orchestra of survival. Food supplies were carefully managed. The cook kept a running inventory of every sack of flour, every slab of bacon, every tin of coffee. When the trail stretched longer than planned, he had to ration tightly: smaller portions, thinner stews, fewer biscuits. The Cowboys understood. They didn't complain much because they knew the cook did his best with what he had. In return, they respected his space. The rule was clear: never touch the cook's gear without permission. His domain was sacred ground. Even in the most brutal heat, when water was scarce and appetites faded, the chuck wagon never stopped. Mealtime was a moment of order in a world of chaos. It was a rhythm that kept the men grounded, morning, noon, and night. The crackle of the fire, the clang of pots, and the smell of coffee drifting through the dry air told the Cowboys that despite the heat, the dust, and the exhaustion, life went on. Life on the cattle drives was not just a battle against the elements, it was a test of endurance in its rawest, most punishing form. The Cowboys who rode across the vast, sun-scorched plains needed more than skill or courage. They needed unbreakable willpower. Every sunrise brought new challenges, and every sunset found them more exhausted than the day before. But quitting wasn't an option. Out on the trail, the only way to survive was to keep going, to fight the heat, the fatigue, and the loneliness with every ounce of strength they had. The physical demands of the job were relentless. A cowboy could spend 12 to 16 hours a day in the saddle, often riding on rough, uneven ground that jarred every bone in his body. The leather of the saddle grew hot under the blazing sun, sometimes burning through layers of fabric. Muscles ached constantly, shoulders from throwing ropes, thighs from gripping saddles, hands from pulling reins and handling cattle. Blisters formed, then hardened into calluses. Every cowboy bore the marks of his work. Cracked skin, sunburned arms, bruised legs, and scars from rope burns or stampedes. Sleep was a rare luxury. Even at night, rest came in short fragments, often interrupted by night watch shifts. The men rotated turns guarding the herd to prevent stampedes or rustlers. A few hours of uneasy sleep on the hard ground, sometimes in wet clothes or dust, was all they got before another long day began. Their bedrolls were simple, a blanket, maybe two, wrapped around them under the open sky. The wind could whip through at night, carrying the chill of the plains, but by sunrise the heat would return, drying the sweat that soaked through their clothes the day before. Dehydration and exhaustion were constant threats. The heat drained energy faster than food or rest could replenish it. Cowboys learned to conserve motion, to ride efficiently, to save their strength for the moments that truly mattered, like rounding up a runaway steer or breaking a stampede. They drank water sparingly, knowing supplies could run out, and they pushed through hunger when meals were delayed. The human body could only endure so much, yet somehow these men managed to carry on, day after day, mile after mile. But it wasn't just their bodies that were tested. The real battle often took place inside their minds. The mental endurance required to survive those endless weeks was immense. Isolation, monotony, and exhaustion could break a man long before hunger or heat did. The landscape seemed to stretch forever. Miles of dry grass, empty skies, and no sign of civilization. The sound of hooves, wind, and cattle became a kind of constant hum that filled their thoughts. There were no distractions, no comforts, no breaks from the repetition. Every day looked and felt the same. The loneliness could be suffocating. Even surrounded by other riders, the trail had a way of making each man feel utterly alone. Conversations were sparse, often limited to the essentials of the job. When words were spoken, they were usually short, gruff, and practical. A warning, a command, or a joke to cut through the tension. But in the quiet stretches between duties, thoughts wandered. Many cowboys thought of home, of families, sweethearts, or the lives they'd left behind. Some wrote letters when they reached small towns, though weeks could pass before they mailed them. Others simply carried their memories in silence, using them as motivation to endure. The mental strain was amplified by danger. Every moment on the trail carried risk. A sudden storm, a spooked herd, a snake bite, or an accident. Cowboys had to stay alert even when their bodies screamed for rest. Falling asleep in the saddle could mean getting thrown, trampled, or lost. The trail demanded full attention and mistakes could be fatal. This constant state of vigilance wore down the spirit. The pressure to stay strong both physically and mentally was immense and not everyone could handle it. Then there was the fear of the unknown. The open plains could turn deadly in an instant. A sudden lightning storm could strike cattle, setting off a stampede. Rivers could swell overnight, making crossings treacherous. Disease could sweep through the herd, wiping out weeks of hard work. The cowboys learned to accept uncertainty as part of life. They didn't control the land, they adapted to it. That adaptability became a core part of their endurance. Pain, fatigue, and hardship were constants, but the cowboys rarely complained. On the trail, complaining didn't solve problems, it only weakened morale. Instead, they joked about their misfortunes, using humor as a shield. A burnt meal, a blister, a lost hat, all became material for laughter. The ability to laugh in misery was a kind of strength, a way to reclaim control when everything else was out of their hands. It bonded them together, gave them resilience when their bodies were running on empty. The heat added another layer to the struggle. Under that burning sun, tempers flared easily. Small arguments could erupt over nothing. A misplaced rope, a stubborn steer, or a careless remark. But true endurance meant more than surviving the heat. It meant managing emotions, keeping discipline, and remembering the shared goal. The cowboys who lasted longest weren't always the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who stayed calm, steady, and focused no matter how unbearable things got. Music and song became lifelines. During the long nights, cowboys sang softly to calm the herd and themselves. The songs were slow, rhythmic, often melancholy, a blend of folk tunes, prayers, and personal verses. Singing helped them pass the time and hold on to a sense of humanity amid the wilderness. Each voice carried across the plains, a reminder that even in solitude, they were part of something larger than themselves. Mental endurance also came from routine. The rhythm of the trail, the early mornings, the drives, the meals, the watches, gave the men structure. That predictability, though repetitive, kept their minds focused. The body might ache and the spirit might waver, but the routine kept them moving forward. It was a silent discipline, a steady drumbeat of survival. Above all, endurance on the cattle drive wasn't about conquering pain, it was about coexisting with it. Every cowboy learned to accept discomfort as natural, to make peace with hardship instead of resisting it. They adapted, toughened, and kept going not because it was easy but because stopping meant defeat. The cattle drive forged not just skilled riders, but men of iron will, molded by heat, exhaustion, and the endless challenge of the trail. Out on the cattle trails, where the sun burned mercilessly and the land stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the cowboys learned a truth that books couldn't teach and money couldn't buy: survival wasn't a one-man job. It depended on brotherhood, a bond forged through dust, sweat, hunger, and danger. Every man on that trail rode not just for himself, but for the others beside him. They might have come from different towns, different upbringings, and even different countries, but once the herd began to move, they became one family, bound by trust, respect, and shared struggle. A cattle drive could last months, covering hundreds of miles through punishing heat, storms, and wilderness. The men faced exhaustion, illness, and injury daily, yet the drive couldn't stop for one man's weakness. That's where brotherhood came in. Every cowboy knew that his survival might one day depend on the man riding next to him. A shared canteen, a lifted hand after a fall, a night of taking extra watch so another could rest. These small acts of loyalty held the group together when the land itself seemed intent on breaking them apart. The trail boss often said that a good crew wasn't made of the toughest men, but of the most dependable ones. Strength could fade under the sun, but character was what got a man through the worst days. Each cowboy earned his place not through words but through action, by doing his job, keeping his word, and standing by his partners when things turned bad. Trust wasn't given easily, it was earned mile by mile, fire by fire, storm by storm. At mealtime, the chuck wagon became the heart of their little community. The cook, often called Cookie, was both their chef and their counselor. His meals, simple as they were, felt like feasts after long days of riding. Around that wagon, men laughed, swapped stories, teased one another, and shared bits of news from home. The fire crackled, and the smoke rose into a sky so vast it made their worries seem small. For a few precious moments, the burdens of the trail lifted, replaced by laughter and the comfort of companionship. But brotherhood wasn't just about laughter, it was about loyalty in the hardest moments. When storms rolled in, when cattle stampeded, or when a man got thrown from his horse and trampled, his brothers were there. They didn't hesitate. They dove into danger because that's what brothers did, not out of duty but out of instinct. They knew the value of every hand, every life. A missing cowboy meant more work for the rest, but it also meant losing a piece of their shared soul. Each man's survival strengthened the group. Each man's fall left a wound that never truly healed. Cowboys didn't talk much about emotions. The code of the West was one of silence and toughness. But under that silence was a deep, unspoken understanding. When a man sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames, the others didn't ask questions. They knew he was thinking about something. Maybe a lost love, maybe a home far away, maybe just the miles ahead. They didn't need to fill the silence with words. Sometimes all it took was the quiet company of a friend to keep loneliness from swallowing a man whole. Disagreements happened, of course. Tempers flared under the heat, and pride was as common as dust. But on the trail, grudges were short-lived. There was no room for division when everyone's safety depended on unity. A man could argue by day and share coffee by night, both knowing that come morning, they'd be riding side by side again. Forgiveness came easy when the land itself offered no mercy. That bond of brotherhood stretched beyond the cowboys themselves. The men shared a connection with their horses and even with the cattle they drove. Horses weren't just tools, they were partners. A cowboy trusted his mount with his life, and the horse, in turn, trusted its rider to guide it through storms and rivers. Cowboys often talked to their horses as if to old friends, patting their necks, whispering soft words before sleep. In a world so harsh and lonely, that connection, man to man, man to animal, gave them strength. During the darkest nights, when the stars blazed overhead and the air cooled just enough to bring relief, the cowboys would sing. Their songs carried across the plains, low, steady tunes that soothed the cattle and comforted their own tired hearts. The melodies spoke of longing, of faith, of home. The harmonies tied them together like invisible threads, each voice blending with the next until it became one sound, the sound of endurance, of shared purpose, of brotherhood. And when tragedy struck, as it often did, the bond grew even stronger. A cowboy thrown from his horse, a man lost to fever, a drowning at a river crossing. The crew buried their dead with quiet dignity, marking the grave with a wooden cross and a few words of prayer. They might ride on the next day, but they never forgot. Around future campfires, They spoke of the fallen like living legends, keeping their memory alive in every story and song. On the trail, death was inevitable, but being forgotten was the real fear, and Brotherhood ensured no one ever was. Even the toughest cowboy had moments of weakness, when thirst burned too deep, when sleep became impossible, when the endless miles broke something inside. That's when Brotherhood proved its worth most. A simple gesture, a shared sip of water, a word of encouragement, a joke to lighten the mood, could pull a man back from despair. In those small human moments they found the strength to ride one more mile. Brotherhood was their shelter from the storm, their anchor in chaos. It gave meaning to the suffering, courage to the weary, and hope to the hopeless. In a land where everything tried to kill them, the heat, the hunger, the isolation, it was the unbreakable bond between men that kept them alive. They may have started as strangers, but by the time they reached the end of the trail, they were something more. Brothers not by blood, but by fire, dust, and survival.